Before the first covered wagon crossed the Mississippi, before the first gold pan touched a California river, before anyone called it the Wild West, there were cities here, not camps, not village, cities. One of them had roads wider than most European streets of its time, aligned to the movements of the sun and stars, with a precision that still surprises researchers today. Another controlled a territory larger than the entire eastern seaboard of the young United States, and forced 3 separate colonial powers to negotiate with it as an equal. A third had been farming the same land continuously for 1,000 years before a single American settler arrived to claim it as empty. None of them appear in the standard story of the American West. That story, the one most Americans were taught, begins with brave settlers crossing open land, with cowboys and gold rushes and cavalry charges, with a destiny so obvious it barely needed explaining. It is a compelling story. Parts of it are true, and it was built deliberately and carefully on top of a history that was considerably more complicated, more violent, and ultimately more interesting than the myth that replaced it. This documentary focuses on the themes and periods that shaped the American West most profoundly. It cannot cover everything. What it can do is tell the story honestly, including the parts that the myth was specifically designed to make invisible. One question will follow us through every chapter. Was the American West an adventure story? Or was it a conquest story? By the end, you will have everything you need to answer that for yourself. Chapter 1. The World Before the Myth. Start with a number that most history books get wrong. For most of the 20th century, the standard estimate of the Native American population of North America before European contact was approximately 1 million people. That number was not based on careful demographic research. It was, as the historian Francis Jennings documented in his foundational work, largely based on the assumption that the land had been nearly empty, an assumption that served the story of westward expansion rather than the historical evidence. The actual scholarly debate about pre-contact population is genuinely contested, and any honest account has to acknowledge that. Estimates among serious researchers range widely, from roughly 7 million on the conservative end to figures several times higher on the more expansive end, with the disagreement reflecting real methodological challenges rather than simple error on either side. What the debate does not support is the figure of 1 million. Even the most conservative modern estimates describe a continent that was substantially populated, politically organized, and anything but empty. Begin in the Southwest, because the Southwest makes the fiction of empty land impossible to maintain. By the year 1000 CE, the people archaeologists call the ancestral Puebloans had constructed Pueblo Bonito in what is now Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. This was not a village. It was a planned structure of more than 600 rooms, aligned with astronomical precision to mark the solstices and equinoxes, connected by a road system extending hundreds of miles across the desert. The roads were 30 feet wide in places. They were engineered with intention, built to connect a regional network of communities that shared ceremony, trade, and political relationships across an enormous geographic area. Researcher Anna Sofair, whose work documents Chaco's astronomical alignments, has shown that the entire built environment was oriented around a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles. This was not accident. This was knowledge, accumulated across generations and expressed in stone. Chaco peaked around 1100 CE, and then, facing prolonged drought documented in tree ring data, dispersed into the communities whose descendants still live in the pueblos of New Mexico and Arizona today. The Hopi, the Zuni, the people of Acoma, they did not disappear. They are still here. And that continuity is itself a fact that the mythology of the vanishing Indian was specifically designed to obscure. Move north and east onto the Great Plains, and you encounter a world of a completely different kind. The plains were not empty grassland waiting for cowboys. They were home to dozens of distinct nations, each with its own political structure, its own territory, its own economy, and its own history stretching back centuries. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crow, the Blackfoot, the Pawnee. These names are familiar from films and from history classes. The actual complexity of their political and economic lives almost never survives the translation into popular culture. Take the Lakota as one example. By the early 18th century, the Lakota had transformed themselves from a woodland people living near the Great Lakes into one of the dominant forces on the northern plains. The catalyst was the horse. Spanish colonizers had reintroduced horses to North America in the late 17th century, and horse culture spread northward through trade networks with extraordinary speed. The Lakota acquired horses and rebuilt their entire society around them. Their hunting range expanded dramatically. Their military capability multiplied. Their political influence extended across an enormous territory they defended with skill and aggression against any encroachment. Native or European, the historian Jeffrey Ostler, whose book, The Lakotas and the Black Hills, is among the most careful examinations of Lakota political history available, documents the degree to which the Lakota were not passive recipients of history. They made strategic choices. They negotiated. They fought. They were active agents in their own story. But if you want to understand the full scale of what existed in the West before the myth arrived, you have to spend time with a civilization that most Americans have genuinely never been taught about in any meaningful way. Not because the sources are thin. The sources are extensive. But because acknowledging this civilization requires a complete rewrite of the story of the frontier. The Comanche Empire. The historian Pekka Hämäläinen, whose book, The Comanche Empire, won the Bancroft Prize and forced a significant reassessment of Western American history, makes an argument that sounds radical until you look at the evidence. From roughly 1700 to 1875 CE, the Comanche were not a tribe resisting American expansion. They were an empire conducting their own expansion, at the expense of Spanish colonial power, Mexican national power, rival native nations, and eventually, at enormous cost, American military power. At their height, the Comanche controlled a territory called Comancheria, stretching across what is now western Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Kansas. This was not held through accident or default. It was held through deliberate military strategy, through a sophisticated raiding and trading economy, through diplomacy that played Spanish, French, Mexican, and American powers against each other with considerable skill. The Spanish Empire spent the better part of a century unable to project consistent military power into Comancheria. Think about that for a moment. The Spanish Empire, unable. We will return to the Comanche in detail later in this documentary. But hold that image for now, because it tells you something essential about the world the American frontier mythology was built to replace. Now add one more layer to this picture, because it is the layer that most popular accounts of the frontier skip entirely. The epidemics that preceded and accompanied European settlement were not incidental to the story of the American West. The historian Alfred Crosby, whose work Ecological Imperialism documented the biological dimensions of European expansion, showed how Old World diseases, smallpox above all, moved ahead of European settlement through native populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. In some regions, mortality rates in affected communities reached staggering levels within a generation of first contact. Entire political structures collapsed. Agricultural knowledge was lost. The oral traditions through which history was transmitted died with the people who carried them. When American settlers and soldiers described the West as empty land, they were, in many cases, describing land that had been emptied within the previous generation by diseases that had traveled faster than any European ever had. The emptiness was not natural. It was recent. It was catastrophic. And it was the precondition for much of what followed. So why does the mythology of an empty frontier persist? Mythologies persist because they serve purposes. The story of empty land waiting for civilization served very specific purposes for very specific people at very specific historical moments. Understanding those purposes is essential to understanding how the myth was constructed, and why dismantling it still produces resistance more than a century after the events it describes. The ancestral Puebloans built their roads before the United States existed. The Comanche built their empire while the United States was still fighting for independence. The Lakota defended their territory with a military sophistication that American generals acknowledged in their memoirs, even when they refused to acknowledge it in their public statements. The American West was not an empty stage, waiting for a cast to arrive. It was a world with its own history, its own politics, its own conflicts, and its own fully realized civilizations. What arrived from the East did not fill a vacuum. It replaced what was there, and the story of how that replacement happened, what it cost, who paid, and what remains of what was lost, is the story this documentary intends to tell completely. Chapter 2. Spain's Ghost, the First Empire in the West. In the summer of 1540, a Spanish explorer named Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an expedition of roughly 300 soldiers and 1,000 native allies northward out of Mexico into territory no European had mapped. He was looking for 7 cities of gold that a Franciscan friar had reported seeing. He traveled through what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. He found no cities of gold. What he found instead was a continent already full of people. Coronado returned to Mexico 2 years later, having covered roughly 4,000 miles of territory that Spain would spend the next 2 centuries attempting to govern. The expedition was considered a failure at the time. In retrospect, it was the beginning of a colonial presence in the American West that would last 250 years, longer than the United States has existed as a nation, and that would shape the landscape, the law, the language, and the culture of the West in ways that the mythology of the frontier was specifically designed to make invisible. This is the version of American history that most people were never taught. Before Plymouth Rock, before Jamestown, before any English colonists set foot on North American soil, the Spanish were already building roads, establishing missions, mapping rivers, and negotiating, sometimes violently, with native peoples across the entire southwestern quarter of the continent. By the time the United States declared its independence in 1776, Spain had been administering colonial territory in what is now New Mexico for nearly 2 centuries. The names are still there if you know how to read them: Los Angeles, San Francisco, Santa Fe, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona. These are not American names that happen to sound Spanish. They are Spanish names that survived the political transition from one empire to another because the places they described had been named, mapped, administered, and inhabited under Spanish colonial rule for generations before any American government claimed them. Start in New Mexico, because New Mexico is where the Spanish colonial presence in the American West runs deepest, and where its consequences are most clearly visible in the historical record. In 1598, a Spanish colonial expedition led by Juan de Onate crossed the Rio Grande and established the first permanent European settlement in the American West at a place he called San Juan de los Caballeros. The date matters. 1598. That is 9 years before the English established Jamestown. The standard American narrative places the origin of national history at Jamestown or Plymouth. But the Spanish had already been building colonial infrastructure in the Southwest for a decade before the English made their first permanent settlement on the Atlantic coast. What Onate established was not a trading post. It was an administrative colony, complete with a legal framework, a mission system, and a labor mechanism called the encomienda, which granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from the native Pueblo communities in their assigned territory. The Pueblo peoples had built Chaco Canyon 5 centuries earlier. They had been farming the same land continuously for 1,000 years. Now they were incorporated into a system that demanded their labor. Their agricultural surplus and their abandonment of religious practices the Spanish missionaries regarded as incompatible with Christianity. There was a man among them, a Tiwa religious leader named Pope, who would spend decades watching what this system did to his people before deciding what to do about it. 82 years of accumulated grievance produced a response. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which Pope organized and directed, coordinated simultaneously across dozens of separate Pueblo communities speaking different languages, drove the Spanish entirely out of New Mexico. 400 Spanish colonists died. The survivors fled south to El Paso. The Pueblo people then systematically dismantled the colonial infrastructure, tearing down churches, washing off baptismal water, burning the records of Spanish administration. It was one of the most successful native uprisings in the history of North America. Most Americans have never heard of it. The Spanish returned in 1692, but when they returned, the terms were meaningfully different. The most aggressive demands for labor and religious conformity were moderated. Pope's revolt had not ended Spanish colonialism in New Mexico. It had negotiated its terms. The historian Andrew Knaut, whose detailed study of the Pueblo Revolt draws on both Spanish colonial records and Pueblo oral traditions, argues that this negotiation shaped the colonial relationship for the remaining century and a half of Spanish rule. A man organized a revolt, changed the terms of an empire, and then was largely erased from the history that Americans are taught. That pattern of real people making real decisions with real consequences, and then being rendered invisible by the mythology that followed, is one of the central patterns this documentary will trace. Move west to California, and you encounter the mission system. 21 missions strung along the coast from San Diego to Sonoma. Established between 1769 and 1823 under the direction of the Franciscan order, Father Junipero Serra oversaw the founding of the first 9. Serra was canonized by Pope Francis in 2015, a decision that generated significant controversy among California Native communities and among historians, because the mission system Serra built whatever its stated spiritual intentions, functioned in practice as a coercive labor institution that caused catastrophic harm to the native peoples it incorporated. The demographic evidence is difficult to look at directly. Before the mission period, historians estimate the indigenous population of California at somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people. By 1850, 2 years after American annexation of California, that population had fallen to approximately 150,000. By 1870, it was below 30,000. The missions contributed to this collapse through a combination of epidemic disease in densely populated compounds, harsh physical conditions, cultural disruption, and in documented cases, physical punishment for attempted escape or resistance. The historian Stephen Hackle, whose biography of Sarah is among the most carefully researched accounts of the period, acknowledges both Sarah's genuine religious conviction and the structural violence of the system he built. These two things are not mutually exclusive. That is precisely what makes the history so difficult and so important to understand honestly. After Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821, the mission lands were formally secularized. The stated intention was to distribute land among the native populations who had worked them. What actually happened, documented by the historian Lisbeth Haas, was that the vast majority of the former mission lands were granted to a small class of Mexican ranching families, the Californios, who established the great ranchos that would themselves be disrupted by American annexation a decade later. And this is the part of the story that the mythology of the frontier almost completely erases. By the time American settlers began arriving in California in the 1840s, the landscape they entered was not empty. It was organized into large ranches, some covering hundreds of thousands of acres, operated by families who had lived in California for 3 and 4 generations and who had a legal and cultural relationship to the land that predated the United States government's claim to it by decades. What happened to those families after the Mexican-American War tells you something essential about how American expansion actually worked. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848 guaranteed the property rights of Mexican citizens living in the ceded territories. The California Land Act of 1851 then required those same citizens to prove their ownership before an American Land Commission, a process that took years, required expensive legal representation, and resulted in the loss of the majority of California land holdings through legal fees, fraudulent surveys, and manipulation of a legal system that English-speaking newcomers understood far better than the families whose land was at stake. The historian Leonard Pitt, whose book, The Decline of the Californios, remains a foundational text on this subject, describes what followed as one of the clearest examples of how formal legal guarantees were systematically undermined in practice. The treaty said one thing, the courts did another. The ghost of Spain in the American West is not subtle if you are looking for it. It is in the names of every major city from San Antonio to San Francisco. It is in the legal frameworks of water rights that still govern agriculture in the Southwest today. It is in the ongoing presence of communities whose families have lived in New Mexico, Texas, and California for 400 years. Understanding that ghost is the necessary first step toward understanding the specific ideology that would be used to justify what came next. That ideology was not improvised. It was carefully constructed, given a memorable name, and published in a specific magazine in a specific year by a specific man with specific political goals. Chapter 3. Manifest Destiny, the idea that moved a nation. On a summer morning in 1845, A New York Magazine editor named John Lewis O'Sullivan sat down to write an editorial that would give a name to something millions of Americans already believed but had not yet found the right words to express. O'Sullivan was not a philosopher or a statesman. He was a journalist and a partisan Democrat with a gift for memorable phrases. The subject of his editorial was the annexation of Texas. He was impatient with the political delays. And in his impatience, he reached for a phrase that would outlast every other sentence he ever wrote. It was, he declared, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. 2 words. Manifest destiny. And in those 2 words, an entire ideology was compressed into a form so elegant and so flexible that it could be applied to virtually any act of territorial expansion the United States chose to undertake, while making that act seem not like a choice at all, but like the inevitable unfolding of divine will. Unpack the phrase carefully, because its components are doing specific work. Manifest means obvious, self-evident, requiring no argument. The destiny of the United States to expand across the continent was not, in O'Sullivan's framing, a political position that required justification or debate. It was simply visible to anyone willing to see clearly. By declaring the conclusion self-evident, O'Sullivan foreclosed the legitimacy of disagreement before the argument had even been made. Destiny means an outcome determined in advance by forces larger than any individual or political decision. Not policy, not choice, destiny, which meant the people in the path of that expansion were not being displaced by decisions that could have gone otherwise. They were simply standing in the way of an inevitable historical process. And Providence meant the authority behind American expansion was not merely political or historical. It was divine. This framing did not emerge from nothing. O'Sullivan was synthesizing ideas that had been developing in American political and religious culture for decades. The Puritan settlers of New England had understood their migration to North America as a covenant with God, a sacred errand to build a godly community that would serve as, in John Winthrop's phrase from 1630, a city upon a hill. That understanding of America as a divinely chosen nation did not die with the Puritan colonies. It was absorbed into the broader Protestant culture of the new republic and became one of the most persistent features of American civic identity. By the 1840s, this theological tradition had been combined with a racial ideology that the historian Reginald Horsman, in his book Race and Manifest Destiny, documents in considerable detail. Leading American politicians, academics, and journalists of the period explicitly framed Western expansion as the spread of what they called Anglo-Saxon civilization, at the expense of peoples they described as racially incapable of development. Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri argued on the floor of the Senate in 1846 that the white race alone had received the divine command to subdue and replenish the earth. The Mexican people were, in Benton's framing, incapable of the kind of civilizational development the continent required. These were not fringe views. They were mainstream political discourse. But here is something the mythology rarely acknowledges. Manifest destiny was not universally accepted even within the United States of the 1840s. The opposition was real, vocal, and politically significant. Henry David Thoreau went to jail rather than pay taxes to support the Mexican-American War, which he regarded as an unjust conquest. A first-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln gave a speech on the floor of the House in 1847 demanding that President James Polk identify the precise spot on American soil where Mexican forces had first shed American blood, the justification Polk had given for declaring war. The abolitionist movement understood manifest destiny as inseparable from the expansion of slavery, because every new territory acquired in the South and West was a potential new slave state. Lincoln's speech did not change the outcome of the war, but it demonstrated that the ideological consensus behind manifest destiny was considerably more contested than its advocates presented it as being. This contestation matters, because one of manifest destiny's most effective rhetorical moves was to present American expansion as the inevitable expression of a unified national will, when in fact it was a political project driven by specific interests, opposed by significant voices, and contingent on specific decisions that could have gone differently. What made manifest destiny so durable, beyond its political convenience, was its capacity to absorb moral objections and convert them into further justifications. When critics pointed out that native peoples were being dispossessed of land they had occupied for thousands of years, advocates responded that native peoples were not using the land productively, that they were nomadic hunters with no conception of private property, and that the highest use of the continent required its transfer to people capable of developing it. This argument is known in legal and philosophical history as the agriculturalist argument, and it was applied consistently across 2 centuries of American expansion. It was also, in most of the cases where it was applied, factually wrong. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest were farmers who had been cultivating the same land for 1,000 years. The Cherokee of the Southeast had adopted American-style agriculture, written constitutions, and legal systems by the 1820s, precisely in hopes of demonstrating the kind of civilizational development that American ideology claimed to value. They were removed anyway. The agricultural argument was not really an argument about land use. It was a justification prepared in advance for a conclusion that had already been reached. Ulysses S. Grant, who served as a young lieutenant in the Mexican-American War and later became both a general and a president, wrote in his memoirs published in 1885 that the war against Mexico was, in his words, one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. He described it as a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed. This is not a revisionist historian writing a century after the fact. This is a participant in the war, writing from direct experience, characterizing it in terms that directly contradict the manifest destiny framing under which it was fought. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February of 1848, transferred to the United States approximately 525,000 square miles of territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Mexico ceded more than half of its national territory. The United States paid $15 million. That payment functioned less as compensation for the land and more as a legal mechanism to avoid characterizing the acquisition as pure conquest. The distinction was politically important and morally thin. The broader point about manifest destiny is this: the ideology was not simply a description of what was happening. It was an active instrument for making things happen and for foreclosing moral objection to what was happening. It removed the question of choice from the equation, and, in removing choice, it removed responsibility. That removal of responsibility is precisely what makes manifest destiny worth examining carefully, because the pattern it established of framing political expansion as the fulfillment of providential destiny rather than the consequence of specific decisions that could have gone otherwise. Did not disappear when the frontier closed. It adapted. It found new applications. And understanding its origins is not merely a matter of historical interest, but in 1845, the immediate application was a continent, and the specific mechanism by which that ideology translated into policy, into military campaigns, into the daily experience of millions of people, is the story that the rest of this documentary will tell. The gold was about to be found. The railroads were about to be built. The wars were about to be fought. And the myth was about to be manufactured, sometimes simultaneously with the events it was mythologizing, by people who understood that controlling the story of the West was almost as valuable as controlling the West itself. Chapter 4. The Louisiana Purchase to the Mexican-American War. In 1800, the United States was a coastal republic hugging the eastern seaboard. Its western boundary was the Mississippi River. The vast territory beyond that river was claimed by France, by Spain, by Britain, and by the dozens of native nations who actually lived there, in arrangements so complicated and so layered that no single map could accurately represent them. In 50 years, the United States absorbed most of that territory, not through a single dramatic act of conquest, through a sequence of purchases, annexations, VARs, and treaties, each one building on the last, each one justified by the ideology that the previous chapter examined, and each one carrying consequences that the mythology of westward expansion consistently underrepresents. Understanding how the territory was acquired requires understanding something that the standard narrative obscures. The land being transferred in these transactions was not the property of the governments that were selling it. France did not own the Louisiana Territory. It had claimed it. Spain did not own the Southwest. It had claimed it. The claiming had been accomplished through the legal doctrine of European colonial sovereignty, which held that European nations could establish ownership over territories by the act of claiming them, regardless of who was already living there. The approximately 200,000 native people living within the Louisiana Territory at the time of the purchase were not consulted, were not compensated, and were not considered parties to a transaction that transferred nominal sovereignty over their homelands between two European-derived governments. Begin with the Louisiana Purchase, because the Louisiana Purchase is usually taught as one of the great bargains in American history. And in narrow financial terms it was. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased from Napoleon Bonaparte approximately 828,000 square miles of territory for $15 million, roughly 3 cents per acre by the calculation that textbooks have repeated ever since. What the textbook framing consistently leaves out is that Napoleon Bonaparte did not own the land he sold. Jefferson understood this, at least partly. His instructions to Meriwether Lewis, who led the famous expedition to explore the Louisiana Territory beginning in 1804, included specific directions to document the native nations encountered, assess their military strength, and identify opportunities for establishing American trade relationships that would extend American political influence into the region. The Lewis and Clark expedition was not purely a scientific enterprise. The historian James Ronda, whose book, Lewis and Clark Among the Indians, remains the most thorough examination of the expedition's interactions with native nations, documents the degree to which Lewis and Clark moved through a landscape that was entirely claimed, entirely inhabited, and in many cases carefully watched by peoples who understood perfectly well that American explorers were likely to be followed by American settlers and American political claims. The Mandan villages on the upper Missouri, where Lewis and Clark spent their first winter, were not remote wilderness outposts. They were thriving commercial centers at the hub of a plains trade network, visited regularly by British, French, and Spanish traders. With a population that outnumbered any American city west of the Appalachians at the time, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 provides the clearest legislative expression of what territorial expansion actually meant for the native peoples living within the expanding republic. Signed by President Andrew Jackson, the act authorized the forced relocation of native nations living east of the Mississippi to territories west of the river. The Cherokee had made extraordinary efforts to accommodate American demands for assimilation. They had adopted a written constitution modeled on the American one. They had established newspapers, schools, and churches. They had, by every measure that American ideology claimed to value, demonstrated the capacity for civilizational development. The Supreme Court, in Worcester versus Georgia, decided in 1832, ruled in the Cherokees' favor. President Jackson's response, according to accounts that may be apocryphal, but that accurately capture the political reality of the moment, was to say that Chief Justice John Marshall had made his decision. Now let him enforce it. The removal proceeded. Between 4,000 and 8,000 Cherokee died during the march. According to estimates compiled by the historian Russell Thornton in his demographic study of Cherokee population history, a people who had done everything they were told to do, removed anyway. That pattern would repeat itself across the next half-century with a consistency that the mythology of the frontier asks you not to notice. The annexation of Texas in 1845 illustrates how deeply American territorial expansion was entangled with the politics of slavery, in ways the mythology consistently refuses to acknowledge. Texas had declared independence from Mexico in 1836, following a revolution led primarily by Anglo-American settlers who had migrated into Texas under Mexican land grants. The Mexican government had made a significant strategic error in encouraging Anglo-American settlement in Texas during the 1820s, believing that the settlers would become Mexican citizens and strengthen Mexico's hold on the sparsely populated northern province. Instead, the settlers brought with them the institution of slavery, which Mexico had abolished in 1829. They maintained their language, their cultural identity, and their political loyalties to the United States. The historian Andrew Torget, whose book, Seeds of Empire, is the most thorough recent examination of the Texas Revolution's origins, documents in detail the centrality of the slavery question to the political dynamics of the revolt. Stephen F. Austin, widely regarded as the father of Anglo-American Texas, wrote explicitly in letters from the period that the maintenance of slavery was among the primary motivations for independence. The Texas Revolution was not simply a revolt of freedom-loving settlers against tyrannical Mexican centralism. President James Polk ordered American troops under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande in January of 1846. When Mexican troops engaged Taylor's forces, Polk declared that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. The geographical claim was disputed. The territory where the engagement occurred had been under Mexican jurisdiction until weeks before the fighting. Grant called the war one of the most unjust ever waged. Lincoln demanded Polk prove his case. Thoreau went to jail. The war lasted from 1846 to 1848 and ended with the American military occupation of Mexico City. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred to the United States approximately 525,000 square miles of territory. Mexico lost roughly 55% of its national territory in a war its own government had not sought. 5 years later, in 1853, the Gadsden Purchase added another 29,000 square miles of territory in southern Arizona and New Mexico, purchased from a Mexican government in no position to refuse American pressure. The purchase was motivated primarily by the desire for a southern route for a transcontinental railroad. By 1853, the contiguous territory of the continental United States was essentially complete. The nation had grown from a coastal republic to a continental empire in half a century, through purchase, annexation, war, and treaty, dispossessing native nations, absorbing a Spanish-speaking population of approximately 100,000 people, establishing American sovereignty over a vast landscape that would spend the next half-century being, in the language of the time, settled. What that settlement actually looked like, who it benefited, who it destroyed, and what it cost, is a story that begins with a discovery in a California mill race in January of 1848. 9 days before the ink dried on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The gold was already there. America was about to find it. Chapter 5. Gold, Greed, and the California Catastrophe. On the morning of January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was inspecting a mill race at Sutter's Mill in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada when something caught his eye in the water. He picked it up. He tested it against his teeth. He showed it to his employer, John Sutter, who confirmed it with an acid test, and then, according to his own later account, felt not joy but dread. Sutter's dread was well-founded. Within months, the discovery had been confirmed, reported, and exaggerated across the continent, and then around the world. By 1849, approximately 90,000 people had arrived in California by sea and overland. By 1852, the peak year of gold production, more than 250,000 people had flooded into a territory that had held perhaps 14,000 non-native residents 2 years before. The gold rush is one of the founding stories of California. Individual enterprise, democratic opportunity, ordinary men striking it rich through grit and luck in a landscape that rewarded neither background nor breeding. That story is real, in the sense that it accurately describes the experience of some of the people who came to California in 1849. It is radically incomplete, in the sense that it systematically omits the experience of the people who were already in California when the 49ers arrived, and of the people who came from China, Chile, Mexico, and other nations, and found that the democratic opportunity of the gold rush applied much more generously to Anglo-Americans than to anyone else. Start with the California native peoples. Before the gold rush, the indigenous population of California had already been significantly reduced by the mission period and by the diseases that accompanied Spanish and Mexican colonization. Historian Sherburne Cook's demographic research estimated the pre-contact California native population at approximately 300,000 people. By 1848, that population had been reduced to approximately 150,000, a loss of roughly half the original population over 80 years of colonial contact. What happened between 1848 and 1870 represents a demographic catastrophe of a different order of magnitude entirely. The gold miners who flooded into California's foothills and river valleys found themselves in direct competition with native communities for the same resources, the same water sources, the same river systems that were both the location of gold deposits and the foundation of native subsistence economies. The response of many miners to the presence of native peoples was immediate and violent. Massacres of native communities were reported within months of the initial gold discovery, conducted not by the military, but by private groups of miners and settlers operating with the knowledge and frequently the active support of local California state government. The historian Benjamin Madley, in his book An American Genocide, documents 145 massacres of native people in California between 1846 and 1973, with the majority concentrated in the 1850s and 1860s. Madley applies the word genocide deliberately, grounding it in the specific legal definition established by the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This is Madley's characterization, and it is one that has generated scholarly debate. But the underlying demographic and documentary evidence he assembles is not seriously contested. California's first governor, Peter Burnett, stated in his address to the state legislature in January of 1851 that, in his words, a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. This was not a fringe position. This was the elected governor of the newest American state, delivering a policy statement to the legislature. On the record, in 1851, the California state government actively funded militia campaigns against native communities throughout the 1850s and 1860s, paying out approximately $1.5 million in state funds for expeditions that the historical record documents as attacks on civilian communities. The federal government reimbursed a significant portion of these expenditures. The demographic result was staggering. By 1870, the California native population had fallen from approximately 150,000 at the time of the gold rush to approximately 30,000 in 22 years. 80% of the surviving California native population was gone. Now consider the 49ers themselves. The gold fields attracted people from across the globe. Approximately 25,000 Chinese immigrants arrived in California between 1849 and 1852. Several thousand Chilean and Mexican miners came north. Significant numbers of people from virtually every part of the world made the journey. What they found, in many cases, was that the democratic opportunity of the gold rush was organized along racial lines. California's foreign miners' tax of 1850 imposed a monthly fee of $20 on foreign-born miners, designed and enforced in ways that targeted Chinese, Mexican, and Chilean miners specifically, while largely exempting European immigrants. $20 per month was approximately 2 months of average wages in the eastern United States. The tax effectively drove many non-Anglo miners out of the most productive areas of the gold fields. The experience of Chinese miners in California during this period established patterns of racial discrimination that would culminate in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It demonstrated that the mythology of democratic opportunity in the American West was, from its earliest expression, a mythology that applied selectively based on race. And John Sutter himself, whose dread on the morning of the discovery proved entirely justified, lost everything: his land, his labor force, his agricultural operation, his cattle herds. All of it was overrun by the flood of miners who poured across his property, disregarding his property claims with the cheerful indifference of people who understood that in the new California, formal legal claims were only as good as your ability to enforce them with force. Sutter spent the rest of his life attempting to obtain compensation from the American government for his losses, and died in Washington in 1880 without having received it. The man who owned the mill where the gold was found died broke, fighting a government that had built a state on top of his land. The gold rush made California American in a way that military conquest alone could not have accomplished. It brought 250,000 people to a territory that had held 14,000 Anglo-American residents before the discovery. And it did so in 2 years, creating facts on the ground that made California's integration into the United States effectively irreversible. It also established California as a state in which the displacement and destruction of native peoples was accepted as a normal feature of the settlement process, rather than a moral problem requiring political response. The gold rush is not simply a story about individual fortune-seeking. It is a story about how a society organizes itself in conditions of rapid resource exploitation. Specifically, it is a story about who gets to participate in that exploitation and who pays the cost of it. The mythology preserves the adventure. The historical record preserves the cost. Both are part of the same story. But the gold rush was only the beginning of the transformation of the American West. What would complete that transformation? What would make the West permanently and inescapably American in every material sense? Was not gold. It was iron. Specifically, the iron rails of the Transcontinental Railroad, which would be completed in one of the most extraordinary feats of engineering in American history by 2 populations of workers who would later be written almost entirely out of the story they built. Chapter 6: The Iron Horse Railroads and the Remaking of the West. There is a photograph taken on May 10th, 1869, at a place called Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory that has become one of the most reproduced images in American history. 2 locomotives face each other on a newly completed track. Crowds of men in suits and work clothes press around them. Champagne bottles are visible. Someone is about to drive a golden spike into a laurel wood tie with a silver hammer, completing the first transcontinental railroad and connecting the Atlantic coast of the United States to the Pacific for the first time in history. Look carefully at the photograph. Notice who is in it. The men crowding around the locomotives are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly well-dressed. The laborers who built the railroad, the men who graded the roadbed, laid the ties, drove the spikes, and blasted through the Sierra Nevada and the Wasatch Mountains, are almost entirely absent from the frame. The celebration was real. The erasure was equally deliberate. His name was Hung Hua, and he is one of the few Chinese foremen whose name appears in the Central Pacific's surviving records. He supervised a crew of Chinese workers on some of the most dangerous sections of the Sierra Nevada Passage. Men who drilled into granite mountains using black powder, who were lowered in wicker baskets over cliff faces to set charges in places no scaffold could reach, who lived in tunnels dug through 40 feet of snow during the winter of 1866 and 1867, while avalanches buried sections of completed track above them. Hung Hua is not in the photograph at Promontory Summit. Neither are any of the approximately 10,000 to 15,000 Chinese workers who made up roughly 90% of the Central Pacific workforce at the peak of Sierra Nevada construction. Charles Crocker, the Central Pacific's construction superintendent, had begun hiring Chinese workers in 1865 after struggling to retain sufficient Anglo-American labor. His initial experiment with 50 Chinese workers proved so successful that he expanded Chinese hiring rapidly. The historian Gordon Chang, whose book Ghosts of Gold Mountain is the most comprehensive scholarly examination of the Chinese railroad workers, estimates that between 1,000 and 1,200 Chinese workers died during Central Pacific construction. Chang acknowledges that figure is likely an undercount, given the inadequacy of the records kept by the railroad company. Chinese workers were paid approximately $26 to $35 per month, compared to $35 per month for white workers doing comparable work, with the additional disadvantage that Chinese workers had to provide their own food, while white workers received food from the company. When Chinese workers organized a work stoppage in June of 1867 to demand equal pay, equal hours, and an end to the most dangerous working conditions, Crocker responded by cutting off their food supply until the strike collapsed after 1 week. The workers returned to their jobs without having achieved any of their demands. 1 week. That is how long it took to break a strike by men who had just spent 2 years blasting through a mountain range. The Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864, signed by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, had authorized the construction and created the financial framework that made it possible. The federal government provided land grants of 10 alternate sections per mile on either side of the track in ordinary territory and 20 sections per mile through mountain territory. The land grants alone totaled approximately 45 million acres. This was land that the federal government had taken from native nations through treaties, many of which were still in the process of being negotiated or were being openly violated at the time the grants were made. The railroad was built on land that had been native territory within the memory of people who were still living, and its construction through the Great Plains cut directly through the territories of nations that had not consented to its passage. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and other Plains nations understood exactly what the railroad represented. It was not simply a transportation route. It was a colonization infrastructure, a mechanism for bringing settlers, soldiers, and supplies into their territories at a speed and scale that would make resistance progressively more difficult. Their attacks on survey crews, construction gangs, and supply trains were not random violence. They were a strategic response to a recognized threat. General William T. Sherman, who commanded the military protection of the railroad construction, wrote in 1867 that the solution was to support the progress of the roads and to clear the country of all hostile Indians. But the railroad's most devastating impact on the Plains nations was not military. It was ecological. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the subsidiary lines that followed it in the 1870s and 1880s enabled and accelerated the commercial buffalo hunting that would, within 2 decades of the railroad's completion, reduce the North American bison herd from an estimated 30 million animals to fewer than 1,000. The relationship between the railroad and the buffalo slaughter was structural, not incidental. The railroad provided the transportation infrastructure that made commercial buffalo hunting economically viable by allowing hunters to ship hides to eastern markets efficiently. And the destruction of the buffalo was understood by military and government officials of the period as a strategic objective in itself. Because the buffalo was the economic foundation of Plains native life in a way so fundamental that its elimination would accomplish what military campaigns had repeatedly failed to achieve. General Philip Sheridan reportedly told the Texas legislature in 1875, when legislators proposed a bill to protect the remaining buffalo herds, that the hide hunters had done more to settle the Indian question than the entire regular army had done in 30 years. Whether or not the specific quote is precisely accurate, it reflects positions that Sheridan expressed in documented correspondence and public statements during this period. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1870, naturalists estimated the southern herd at approximately 4 million animals. By 1875, commercial hunters had reduced it to near zero. The northern herd was effectively eliminated by the mid-1880s. By 1889, the American bison, which had numbered in the tens of millions and sustained plains native cultures for thousands of years, existed in only a few small protected groups, their total number estimated at fewer than 1,000 animals. The railroad also transformed the economic and political geography of the West in ways that permanently altered the landscape of power. The land grants gave railroad companies ownership of approximately 175 million acres across the western states, an area larger than the state of Texas. The historian Richard White, whose book Railroaded is the most comprehensive recent study of the transcontinental railroads and their consequences, describes the railroad corporations as among the most powerful and most corrupt political actors in American history, using their land grants and their control over transportation to exercise a degree of economic and political power over the western states, whose full effects took generations to untangle. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 did not close the American West. It opened it in a new and more intensive way, bringing settlers, merchants, miners, and soldiers into territories that had been effectively inaccessible before, accelerating every process already underway. The wars for the Great Plains were already underway when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit. The railroad had not created those wars, but it was reshaping their military mathematics in ways that would determine their outcome within 2 decades. And Hong Va, whose name appears in the records, whose hands helped drive the stakes that made the survey line through the Sierra Nevada possible, went home to an America that had decided he was not part of its story. The men who fought the wars that followed would face a similar erasure, though the mythology that replaced their actual history would be considerably more elaborate, considerably more profitable, and considerably more persistent. That is where we go next. Chapter 7. The Plains Wars, the longest war America forgot. There is a war in American history that lasted longer than the Civil War, involved more military engagements than most Americans are taught about, produced some of the most significant American military defeats of the 19th century, and ended with a massacre of unarmed civilians that the United States Army awarded 20 Medals of Honor to the soldiers who conducted it. This war does not have a single agreed name in American history curricula. It is sometimes called the Indian Wars, sometimes the Plains Wars, sometimes broken into separate regional conflicts, as if Sand Creek and Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee were unrelated events rather than chapters in a continuous story. The fragmentation is not accidental. A continuous story has a moral logic that fragmented incidents do not. The continuous story begins, for the purposes of this chapter, in 1864, though its roots go back to the removal policies of the 1830s and the broken promises that accumulated through 2 decades of Western expansion. It begins with a massacre in Colorado that the commander who ordered it called a great victory, and that subsequent investigation established as one of the most deliberate atrocities in American military history. Sand Creek. By the autumn of 1864, the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples of the Colorado Territory had been under increasing pressure from the flood of settlers that followed the Colorado Gold Rush of 1859. The Fort Wise Treaty of 1861 had already confined the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho to a reservation that was a fraction of the territory they had occupied under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The reservation land was largely arid and unsuitable for the buffalo hunting economy that sustained their lives. Tensions between native communities and settlers had produced a series of violent incidents through 1863 and 1864. In the summer of 1864, Colorado's territorial governor John Evans issued a proclamation authorizing all citizens to kill and destroy hostile Indians wherever they can be found. There was a Cheyenne chief named Black Kettle. He had signed the Fort Wise Treaty. He had consistently advocated for peace with the United States through years of accumulated pressure and broken promises. He had done everything that American officials told him peaceful Native leaders were supposed to do. When a military commander at Fort Lyon told him that bands camped near the fort would be considered friendly and protected, Black Kettle led his people to Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado and made camp. On the morning of November 29, 1864, Colonel John Milton Chivington led approximately 700 Colorado militia volunteers in an attack on that camp. Black Kettle heard the approaching soldiers. He raised an American flag above his lodge, then a white flag. The attack continued. What followed lasted several hours. The number of Cheyenne and Arapaho killed at Sand Creek is estimated at between 150 and 200 people, the majority of whom were women, children, and elderly men. Since most of the warrior-age men had left the camp to hunt, the militia mutilated the bodies of the dead. Soldiers returned to Denver with body parts that were displayed publicly at a theater in the city to considerable popular enthusiasm. Chivington described it as a brilliant feat of arms. Congressional investigations in 1865 established the facts with considerable clarity. Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, who chaired the investigation, described what had occurred as a foul and dastardly massacre which would have disgraced the veriest savage among those who were the victims of its perpetrators. Chivington escaped court-martial only because he had already resigned his commission before the investigation concluded, placing him outside military jurisdiction. Sand Creek did not end the conflict on the Southern Plains. It intensified it dramatically. News of the massacre spread through Cheyenne and Arapaho communities and reached the Lakota and other Plains nations, confirming for those who had been skeptical of American intentions that peace negotiations were a mechanism for positioning Native peoples for attack rather than a genuine offer of coexistence. The Cheyenne warrior Howling Wolf, who survived Sand Creek as a child, later said that Sand Creek was the cause of more war than anything else that had happened. A man raised a white flag. The attack continued, and the consequences of that decision echoed across the next 3 decades of the Plains Wars. The Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 attempted to confine the Southern Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Kiowa, and Plains Apache to reservations in Indian Territory. The treaty was signed. It was also undermined almost immediately by the continued encroachment of buffalo hunters and settlers onto reservation lands, by the failure of the federal government to deliver the food, tools, and other supplies it had promised, and by the continued military operations that General Sheridan authorized under his strategy of winter campaigning against Native communities. The most notorious product of that strategy came in November of 1868, when Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry in a dawn attack on Black Kettle's village on the Washita River in Indian Territory. Black Kettle, again, the man who had survived Sand Creek, who had continued to advocate for peace despite everything, who had raised a white flag over his lodge and watched the attack continue anyway, was killed in his own village on the Washita River 4 years later, in a dawn attack conducted by the same army he had spent years trying to make peace with. Custer reported the engagement as a great victory. On the northern plains, the conflict took a different shape because the military situation was genuinely different. The Lakota, under leaders including Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse, were a military force of a different capability, and the geography of the northern plains and Black Hills region provided defensive advantages that the southern plains did not offer. Red Cloud's War, fought from 1866 to 1868 over the Bozeman Trail, which cut through the heart of Lakota territory in present-day Wyoming and Montana to reach the Montana gold fields, represents the only military conflict in American history in which the United States negotiated a peace treaty on terms that amounted to a complete surrender of American objectives. The Army had established 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail over Lakota objections. Red Cloud organized a sustained campaign of harassment and interdiction against these forts and the trail they were meant to protect, making the route effectively unusable. On December 21, 1866, a Lakota force, under the tactical direction of Crazy Horse, lured Captain William Fetterman and 80 soldiers out of Fort Phil Kearny through a decoy maneuver and killed all 81 of them, in what the Army called the Fetterman Disaster. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 ended Red Cloud's War. It required the United States to abandon the 3 Bozeman Trail forts and close the trail entirely. It recognized Lakota sovereignty over a Great Sioux reservation encompassing the western half of present-day South Dakota, including the Black Hills, and designated additional unceded territory in Wyoming and Montana where the Lakota would retain hunting rights. Red Cloud had gone to war over specific demands and achieved them. The United States had agreed, in a formal treaty ratified by the Senate, to terms that represented a genuine military and political defeat. The treaty lasted 6 years. In 1874, Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, which were within the Great Sioux Reservation and therefore off limits to American entry under the 1868 treaty, and reported the discovery of gold. Gold seekers flooded into the Black Hills in 1875 in direct violation of the treaty. The federal government made a nominal effort to stop them, found the task politically impossible given the pressure from settlers and mining interests, and then pivoted to attempting to purchase the Black Hills from the Lakota. The Lakota refused to sell. The Black Hills, which the Lakota called Paha Sapa, were not simply economically valuable territory. They were the sacred center of Lakota spiritual geography, the place of vision quests and ceremonial practice that could not be evaluated in monetary terms. The historian Jeffrey Ostler documents the negotiations of 1875 in detail and argues that the United States government understood perfectly well that the Lakota were not going to sell, and that the military campaign that followed was a predetermined response to a refusal that had been anticipated before the negotiations began. In December of 1875, the federal government issued an ultimatum requiring all Lakota bands to report to their reservation agencies by January 31st, 1876. The deadline was militarily impossible to meet for many bands, particularly those in the Powder River country, because winter travel conditions on the northern plains in January made movement of entire communities effectively impossible. The deadline was not set in ignorance of these conditions. What followed in the summer of 1876 produced the most famous battle in the history of the Plains Wars, and because of who died in it, the one that American mythology has most thoroughly preserved while most thoroughly misunderstanding. On June 25, 1876, Custer divided his 7th Cavalry Regiment and led approximately 210 men in a direct attack on a massive encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne on the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. The encampment included warriors under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, numbering somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 fighting men, by the estimates of military historians who have examined the evidence most carefully. Custer and every man under his immediate command were killed. Total American losses at Little Bighorn were 268 soldiers killed and 55 wounded. It was the largest American military defeat in the Plains Wars. The mythology of Little Bighorn transformed Custer almost immediately into a martyred hero, a cavalryman of dashing courage brought down by savage treachery. The irony that Custer had led an illegal expedition into treaty-protected territory 2 years earlier, had divided his force in the face of a known concentration of warriors, and had attacked a village of men, women, and children in a pattern no different from the winter campaigns he had conducted before, was entirely absent from the mythological version of events that newspapers, demon novels, and later Hollywood constructed from his death. The intensified military campaign that followed Little Bighorn accomplished what earlier campaigns had not. By the spring of 1877, Crazy Horse had surrendered at Fort Robinson. Sitting Bull had led a portion of his people into Canada. The Black Hills were taken through a combination of military pressure, withholding of food from reservation populations, and a requirement that 3/4 of adult Lakota men sign the agreement, which Ostler documents was not met, making the cession legally invalid under the terms of the 1868 treaty. The Supreme Court of the United States, in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, decided in 1980, ruled that the taking of the Black Hills had been an illegal taking of property without just compensation, and awarded the Lakota $102 million in compensation. The Lakota refused the money. They have continued to refuse it as additional interest has accumulated, bringing the total to well over $1 billion. They want the land, not compensation for its theft. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what the Black Hills represent and why the legal and moral question has never been resolved. The final chapter of Armed Resistance on the Plains was written not in battle, but in massacre. And the massacre was preceded by a ghost. In 1888 and 1889, a Paiute spiritual leader named Wovoka had a vision during a solar eclipse in which he received a message about a ceremony called the Ghost Dance. As the Ghost Dance spread through reservation communities of the Great Plains in 1890, it carried a specific promise. If the people danced and lived righteously, the buffalo would return, the dead would be resurrected, and the settlers would be removed from the land. The Ghost Dance was not a military movement. It was a spiritual response to desperation, spreading through communities that had been reduced from sovereign nations to dependent populations in less than a generation. The reservation agents and military commanders who watched it spread interpreted it through the lens of their own anxieties, rather than through any careful assessment of what was actually happening. The movement was reported to Washington as a prelude to armed uprising. The military was mobilized. Sitting Bull was arrested on December 15, 1890, and killed in the struggle that accompanied his arrest. A band of Lakota under a chief named Bigfoot, which included many ghost dancers and many survivors of earlier military actions, fled south toward the Pine Ridge Reservation. They were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, near a creek called Wounded Knee on December 28, 1890. The following morning, while the soldiers were disarming the band, a shot was fired. No historical source agrees on who fired it or why. What followed lasted less than an hour. The soldiers opened fire with rifles and with Hotchkiss mountain guns, rapid-fire artillery pieces, into the camp. Men, women, and children fled in all directions. The soldiers pursued them for miles across the frozen ground. When the firing stopped, approximately 250 Lakota were dead, scattered across the landscape around the creek. The bodies froze in the winter cold and were buried in a mass grave 3 days later. 20 Medals of Honor were awarded to soldiers who participated in the engagement at Wounded Knee. It remains the largest number of Medals of Honor awarded for a single engagement in American history. The medals have never been rescinded. Despite campaigns by Lakota leaders and their supporters that have reached the United States Congress repeatedly over the past 3 decades, Wounded Knee is the end of the armed resistance of the Plains Wars. But it is not the end of what those wars set in motion. The policies that followed would attempt to complete through legal and cultural mechanisms what the military campaigns had accomplished through force. But before we reach those policies, we need to spend time with the mythology that was being constructed around the West during the same decades that the Plains Wars were being fought. Because the Wild West that Buffalo Bill was packaging into entertainment in the 1880s was not a misremembering of what had happened. It was a replacement for what had happened, built while the people who had experienced it were still alive to contradict it. And it was extraordinarily profitable. Chapter 8: The Comanche Empire and the Cost of Erasure. There is a map that most Americans have never seen. It is not a difficult map to find. It appears in history books, in academic journals, in the work of scholars who have spent careers documenting what it represents. But it does not appear in the standard American history curriculum, in the popular mythology of the West, or in the films and television series that have shaped how most people understand the frontier. The map shows the territory controlled by the Comanche at the height of their power in the early 19th century, stretching across what is now western Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, and into Colorado. The territory has a name, Comanche, and the civilization that controlled it was not a tribe resisting American expansion. It was an empire conducting its own expansion. The historian Pekka Hämäläinen, whose book The Comanche Empire won the Bancroft Prize and forced a significant reassessment of Western American history, makes an argument that sounds radical until you look at the evidence. From roughly 1700 to 1875 CE, the Comanche dominated the southern plains at the expense of Spanish colonial power, Mexican national power, rival native nations, and eventually, at enormous cost over many decades, American military power. At their height, the Comanche controlled Comancheria through deliberate military strategy, through a sophisticated raiding and trading economy, through diplomacy that played Spanish, French, Mexican, and American powers against each other with considerable skill, and through a cavalry tradition that many military historians regard as among the most effective light cavalry forces in the world during the 18th and early 19th centuries. The Spanish Empire spent the better part of a century unable to project consistent military power into Comancheria. To understand how the Comanche built this, you have to go back to the moment of its creation, when Spanish colonizers re-established their presence in New Mexico after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. They brought horses back into the Southwest. Within decades, horse culture had spread northward through trade networks with extraordinary speed. The group that would become the Comanche, then living near the upper Arkansas River, acquired horses sometime around 1700 CE and adapted to equestrian life with a completeness that transformed them from a marginal group in a competitive landscape into the dominant military force on the southern plains. Within a single generation, The Comanche did not simply add horses to an existing way of life. They rebuilt their entire society around the horse, developing horsemanship skills that military observers from Spain, Mexico, and the United States consistently described as among the finest in the world. By 1750, the Comanche had driven the Apache from the southern plains, establishing control over the rich buffalo hunting grounds of the Texas Panhandle and the adjacent territories. By 1770, they had extended their influence far enough to force the Spanish colonial administration in Texas into a formal peace treaty. The General Peace of 1786 that acknowledged Comanche power and established trade relationships on terms that the Comanche effectively dictated. The Spanish relationship with the Comanche illustrates the fundamental reality of power in the 18th century Southwest. Spain was nominally the colonial sovereign of Texas and New Mexico. The Comanche were the actual dominant force in the region. When the Comanche chose to trade peacefully, commerce flourished. When Comanche bands raided Spanish settlements, the Spanish had limited capacity to respond effectively. The terms of the relationship were set by the Comanche, not by the nominal colonial sovereign. The Anglo-American settlers who flooded into Texas during the 1820s and 1830s brought with them a set of assumptions about land ownership and racial hierarchy that were fundamentally incompatible with the FOST Comanche conception of their territory and their sovereignty. The conflict that resulted was sustained, brutal, and strategically complex. And this is where the story of one specific man becomes the story of the entire Comanche experience in miniature. His name was Quanah. His mother was Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman who had been taken in a raid on a Texas settlement in 1836 at the age of approximately 12 and had grown up Comanche, married a chief named Peta Nocona, and had 3 children before being recaptured by Texas Rangers in 1860. Quanah himself, born in the late 1840s or early 1850s, grew up Comanche, became a war leader of the Quahati Band, and fought American military forces throughout the early 1870s with a skill and determination that made him one of the most formidable adversaries the United States Army encountered on the Southern Plains. The Red River War of 1874 and 1875, conducted by General Ranald Mackenzie and Colonel Nelson Miles using Sheridan's winter campaign strategy, broke Comanche military resistance not through a single decisive battle, but through relentless pursuit across seasons. The destruction of Comanche winter camps and food supplies, and most decisively, the killing of the Comanche horse herds. In September of 1874, Mackenzie destroyed a Comanche encampment in Palo Duro Canyon and ordered the killing of approximately 1,400 Comanche horses. Without horses, the Comanche could not hunt, could not travel, could not fight, and could not sustain themselves through the approaching winter. The last free Comanche bands came into the reservation at Fort Sill in the spring of 1875. Quanah came in with them. And then something unexpected happened. Quanah Parker, because he took his mother's surname after her death, spent the next 3 decades becoming one of the most influential Native American leaders of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He navigated the reservation system with the same strategic intelligence he had applied to warfare. He built alliances with Texas ranchers who leased Comanche grazing lands. He traveled to Washington to negotiate directly with federal officials, understanding that the political arena was now the battlefield that mattered. He maintained Comanche cultural practices, including the Native American Church, which he helped establish, while simultaneously engaging with American economic and political life on terms that preserved Comanche identity within an entirely new context. He was photographed in traditional Comanche dress. He was also photographed in a suit. He understood that survival required both. Quanah Parker died in 1911. Having lived long enough to see both the destruction of the world his father had fought for and the beginning of a Comanche cultural persistence that has continued to the present day. The Comanche Nation of Oklahoma has approximately 17,000 enrolled members today. His story is worth holding on to because it is a story about what happens after the mythology ends. About the people who kept living in the world the mythology was designed to describe as finished. What does the erasure of the Comanche Empire from standard American history cost us? It costs us accuracy. First of all, a history of the American West that does not account for the Comanche cannot explain why Spanish Texas failed, why the Texas Republic spent a decade fighting for its survival, why the United States Army required nearly 2 decades and a complete revision of its tactical doctrine to subdue a single people in a region it had nominally claimed since the Mexican-American War. But the erasure costs us something beyond accuracy. It costs us the full moral complexity of what actually happened. The Comanche were not simply victims of American expansion, though they were that in the end. They were also an imperial power that expanded at the expense of other peoples, that conducted raids that caused genuine suffering across a vast region. Acknowledging the full reality of the Comanche Empire does not require choosing between condemning them and celebrating them. It requires seeing them as what they were: a human civilization with human complexity, making strategic choices in a world of competing powers. That is a more demanding story than either the mythology of savage resistance to noble progress or the counter-mythology of innocent victims of colonial violence. But it is the story that the evidence supports. And the spine question that opened this documentary, adventure or conquest, gets considerably more complicated when you realize that the Comanche were running their own version of both at the same time. Chapter 9: Cowboys, Outlaws, and the Invention of the Wild West. Here is a fact that the mythology of the American West has spent 150 years obscuring with considerable success. The era of the open-range cattle drive, the period that produced the cowboy as an American cultural icon. The longhorn cattle drives from Texas to the Kansas railheads. The trail bosses and the cowhands in the cattle towns of Abilene and Dodge City lasted approximately 20 years. 20 years, from roughly 1867, when the first major cattle drive reached the railroad at Abilene, Kansas, to approximately 1886 and 1887, when a series of catastrophic blizzards and drought conditions collapsed the open-range cattle industry across the Great Plains. 20 years. That is less time than many people spend in a single career. The gap between the brevity of the historical moment and the enormous cultural weight that has been placed on it is not an accident. It is the product of deliberate mythological construction that began, in some cases, before the cattle drives themselves had ended. Understanding how the myth was built requires understanding first what the cattle industry actually was and who actually worked in it. The Texas Longhorn cattle that became the foundation of the post-Civil War cattle industry were themselves a product of Spanish colonial ranching culture. The cattle had been brought to the Americas by Spanish colonizers in the 16th century and had spread northward through the mission and rancho system, running semi-wild on the Texas range during the Civil War, while the Anglo-American ranchers who nominally owned them were away fighting. By the end of the war, an estimated 5 million longhorn cattle roamed the Texas range, available to anyone willing to gather and brand them. But the skills required to gather and brand and drive 5 million cattle across hundreds of miles of open range did not appear from nowhere. The techniques of open-range cattle management, the skills of roping, branding, herding on horseback, reading the landscape for water and grass, all of it derived from the vaquero tradition of Spanish and Mexican ranching that had been practiced in Texas, California, and the Southwest for 2.5 centuries before the first Anglo-American cowboy mounted a horse. The word cowboy is a direct translation of vaquero. The lasso comes from the Spanish lazo. The chaps come from the Spanish chaparreras. The rodeo comes from the Spanish rodear, meaning to surround. The entire vocabulary and the entire technical practice of the American cowboy was inherited from Mexican ranching culture. The mythology took the skills and erased the source. And then there is the racial composition of the actual cattle drive workforce, which the mythology erases even more completely. The historian Philip Durham, whose book The Negro Cowboys is the foundational scholarly study of African American participation in the cattle industry, estimated that approximately 1 in 4 cowboys in the cattle drive era was African American. This figure has been broadly supported by subsequent scholarship, with ongoing debate about the specific methodology, and the honest account acknowledges that debate. But even the more conservative estimates describe a workforce significantly more diverse than the mythology presents. 1 in 4, most of them from Texas, most of them recently freed from slavery, working in an industry that offered wages and mobility that the sharecropping system of the post-war South did not. There was a man named Nat Love. He was born into slavery in Tennessee in 1854, freed at the end of the Civil War, and made his way to Texas at age 15. He spent 20 years as a working cowboy before publishing his autobiography in 1907. His account of life on the trail is one of the most detailed first-person records of the cattle drive era available. It describes a working life in which his race was a constant feature of his experience, but did not prevent him from becoming one of the most skilled ropers and riders on the range. His autobiography has been sitting in libraries for more than a century. Its absence from the standard Western canon is a choice, not an accident. There was also a man named Bill Pickett, born in Texas in 1870 to a father of African American and Cherokee descent, who became one of the most celebrated rodeo performers of the early 20th century, credited with inventing the technique of bulldogging that became a standard rodeo event. He performed before audiences including King George V of England. He was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in 1971, decades after the mythology of the cowboy had been thoroughly established without reference to people like him. The cattle towns that served as the destinations of the great drives, Abilene, Wichita, Dodge City, Caldwell, were genuinely rough places, but they were considerably less violent than the mythology presents them. The historian Robert Dykstra, whose book The Cattle Towns conducted a careful quantitative analysis of homicide rates in the major Kansas cattle towns during the peak years of the cattle drives, found that the total number of homicides in Dodge City, Abilene, Wichita, Caldwell, and Ellsworth combined, across all the years of the cattle drive era, was approximately 45 homicides, 5 towns, approximately 15 years. This does not mean the cattle towns were peaceful. It means that the image of constant gunfighting that the mythology presents is a significant exaggeration of a reality that was itself genuinely dangerous, but considerably more complicated than the dime novels and later the films portrayed it. The specific figures who became the iconic heroes and villains of the Wild West mythology were in most cases people whose actual lives bore limited resemblance to the characters constructed around their names. Wyatt Earp spent much of his adult life as a gambler, a saloon keeper, and a man whose relationship with the law was considerably more complicated than the role of heroic frontier marshal suggests. The gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, on October 26, 1881, lasted approximately 30 seconds, involved 8 men at close range, and killed 3 people. It was preceded by weeks of political and economic conflict between the Earp faction and the Clanton and McLaury faction that had more to do with control of Tombstone's criminal economy than with any straightforward conflict between Abby-Detoon, law and lawlessness. The historian Casey Teffertiller, whose biography of Earp is among the most carefully researched accounts of his life, describes the OK Corral gunfight as a political killing as much as a law enforcement action. Other historians have assessed Earp's conduct more favorably, and the historical debate continues. What is not debated is that the mythological Wyatt Earp was largely created by his friend Stuart Lake, whose biography, Wyatt Earp Frontier Marshal, published in 1931, invented quotes, created incidents that did not occur, and constructed a narrative of heroic frontier law enforcement that served the cultural needs of the early 20th century more accurately than it served the historical record of the late 19th. The person most responsible for packaging the Wild West into a cultural product that could be sold to a mass audience was William Frederick Cody, known to history as Buffalo Bill. Cody had genuine credentials as a plainsman, an Army scout, and a buffalo hunter, and those credentials gave him the raw material for a persona that he then elaborated, embellished, and mass-produced with a showman's genius for understanding what audiences wanted to see. His Wild West show, which he launched in 1883 and toured continuously for 30 years, was one of the most successful entertainment enterprises of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Seen by millions of people in the United States and Europe, the show employed actual Native American performers, including Sitting Bull, who toured with the show for one season in 1885 before leaving. The historian Joy Casson, in her study Buffalo Bill's Wild West, examines the participation of Native performers with considerable nuance. The Native performers had their own reasons for participating, including wages, travel, and the opportunity to present themselves to audiences that had been given no other source of information about them. But the framework in which they appeared was Cody's framework, and Cody's framework was the mythology, not the history. The Wild West show was packaging the West as entertainment while the actual West was still happening. Sitting Bull toured with the show in 1885. He was killed at Standing Rock in 1890. The gap between those two dates is 5 years. The problem with the Wild West mythology is not that it celebrated courage and skill in a difficult landscape. Those things were real and deserve acknowledgement. The problem is what the mythology required to be invisible in order to function. The erasure of the Mexican and African American workers who built the cattle industry. The transformation of native peoples from complex civilizations with their own histories into generic adversaries whose role in the story was to provide dramatic opposition to Anglo-American heroism. The conversion of specific, morally complicated events into simple stories of good and evil. The mythology was not simply entertainment. It was an argument about who belonged in the West, who had built it, and who deserved it. And that argument had consequences that extended far beyond the pages of dime novels and the canvas tents of Wild West shows. Chapter 10. Broken Promises: The Reservation System and What It Actually Was. There is a phrase that appears in American political rhetoric with such regularity that it has become almost invisible through repetition. The phrase is that the United States government has a special trust responsibility to Native American nations, a legal and moral obligation rooted in the treaties, statutes, and court decisions that define the relationship between the federal government and the sovereign Native nations within its borders. The phrase is legally accurate. The trust responsibility is real, documented in hundreds of court decisions, codified in federal statute, and acknowledged by every branch of the American government. What the phrase does not convey is that the trust responsibility was built on top of a systematic effort to dismantle the land bases, eliminate the cultural practices, and undermine the distinct political existence of the very nations it claimed to protect. Understanding this contradiction is not a matter of cynicism about American institutions. It is a matter of reading the historical record honestly. The people who designed and implemented federal Indian policy during this period were not, in most cases, people who described themselves as enemies of Native peoples. Many believed sincerely that what they were doing was in the best interests of the people whose lives they were disrupting. The road from that sincerity to the documented consequences of their policies is one of the most instructive passages in the history of American political intention and its relationship to political reality. The reservation system, as it existed by the 1870s, was the product of decades of treaty-making that had progressively reduced the territories of Native nations from their original homelands to designated areas where the federal government promised they could live without interference. The promises were specific. They were legally binding. They were ratified by the Senate as the supreme law of the land. They were also, with a consistency that the historical record documents without ambiguity, broken. The pattern was established early and repeated often enough to constitute policy in practice, if not always an explicit statement. A treaty would be negotiated, usually under conditions of military pressure or economic desperation. The treaty would establish a reservation boundary and promise federal protection of that boundary against encroachment by settlers. Settlers would encroach. The federal government would prove unable or unwilling to enforce the boundary against the political pressure of its own citizens. A new treaty would be negotiated, further reducing the reservation territory. The process would repeat. The historian Vine Deloria Jr., whose book Behind the Trail of Broken Treaties examined the treaty record with the precision of a trained lawyer, documented pattern after pattern of federal treaty violation that the standard historical narrative had consistently minimized or ignored. The Dawes Act of 1887, formerly known as the General Allotment Act, represents what many historians regard as the single most consequential piece of federal legislation in the history of Native American land dispossession. And it was passed with the explicit support of reformers who believed it would benefit Native peoples. The Act's mechanism was straightforward. Reservation lands held collectively by Native nations would be divided into individual allotments, typically 160 acres per head of household, to be held in trust by the federal government for 25 years and then transferred to individual Native ownership as American citizens. The land remaining after allotment, the surplus, would be open to purchase by non-Native settlers. Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, who authored the legislation, visited the Cherokee Nation before writing the bill and returned with what he considered a damning observation. There was not a pauper in that nation, he reportedly said. and the nation did not owe a dollar. It built its own capital and had its schools and hospitals. Yet the defect of the system was apparent. They have got as far as they can go, because they own their land in common. Then came the sentence that reveals the underlying logic of the entire policy. There is no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. A nation without paupers and without debt was, in Dawes's framework, a nation that had failed to develop properly, because proper development in the American model required the inequality, the indebtedness, and the individual competition for resources that communal land ownership prevented. The actual consequences of the Dawes Act were exactly the opposite of what its proponents claimed to intend. Native land holdings, which totaled approximately 138 million acres in 1887 when the act passed, had been reduced to approximately 48 million acres by 1934, when the Indian Reorganization Act formally ended the allotment policy. 90 million acres of native land, an area larger than the state of Montana, transferred out of native ownership in 47 years. This transfer happened through the combined mechanisms of allotment surplus sales, fraudulent purchases of allotted lands during the trust period, tax sales of lands after the trust period ended, and outright theft facilitated by the legal and bureaucratic complexity of the allotment system. The historian Angie Debo, whose book And Still the Waters Run is the definitive account of the dispossession of the 5 civilized tribes, documents in exhaustive detail the systematic fraud through which the allotment of Indian territory transferred enormous quantities of native-owned land to non-native purchasers in the years surrounding Oklahoma statehood in 1907. The probate courts that administered the estates of native allottees were in many cases operating in ways that subsequent investigators found difficult to explain as isolated misconduct. Guardians appointed by probate courts to manage the affairs of native minors who had inherited allotments routinely charged fees that consumed the entire value of the estates they were supposed to protect. The land loss was only one dimension of what was happening during this period. The boarding school system operated simultaneously with a different but related objective. Richard Henry Pratt, an Army officer who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879, articulated the philosophy of the boarding school system in a phrase that has become one of the most cited in the history of American Indian policy. The goal, Pratt said in a speech in 1892, was to kill the Indian in him and save the man. Pratt believed sincerely that this was a humanitarian program, the alternative to cultural destruction. In his framework was physical destruction, the continuation of the military campaigns that were killing native people. Better to destroy the culture and save the person than to destroy both. The consequences of the boarding school system have been documented in survivor testimonies, in federal investigations, and most recently, in the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report, released by the Department of Interior in 2022, which identified over 400 federally operated or funded boarding schools that operated between 1819 and 1969. The boarding school separated children from their families, sometimes for years at a time. They prohibited the speaking of native languages, sometimes under threat of physical punishment. They replaced native names with English names. They required attendance at Christian religious services and forbade the practice of traditional spiritual ceremonies. The consequences were not limited to the children who attended. They were transmitted through the disruption of family structures and cultural transmission to subsequent generations. The epidemic rates of substance abuse, depression, and family violence documented in many Native communities in the 20th and 21st centuries are connected by a direct historical thread to the sustained disruption of cultural transmission that the boarding school system was designed to produce. This connection is documented in research from psychologists, sociologists, and public health researchers who use the term historical trauma to describe the intergenerational transmission of these consequences. Think about what that means in practical terms. You do not have to reach back to the 19th century to feel what happened there. The consequences are present today in ways that public health researchers can measure. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 formally ended the allotment policy and attempted to rebuild native governmental structures and land bases. The act stopped the hemorrhage of land out of native ownership and provided a legal framework for tribal self-governance that represented a genuine improvement over the allotment era. The termination policy of the 1950s then reversed course again, withdrawing federal recognition and services from specific native nations deemed sufficiently assimilated. More than 100 native nations were terminated between 1953 and 1964, losing federal recognition, land held in trust, and access to federal services. The American Indian Movement, founded in Minneapolis in 1968, represented the entry of Native political activism into the broader context of the American civil rights movements of that decade. The occupation of Alcatraz Island from 1969 to 1971. The Trail of Broken Treaties, March to Washington in 1972, and the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973 were expressions of political frustration with a reservation system and a federal trust relationship that had failed across a century of operation to deliver the protection and support it was legally obligated to provide. The second occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, in which approximately 200 members of the Oglala, Lakota, and American Indian movement occupied the site of the 1890 massacre for 71 days, connected the political demands of 1973 to the specific history of the United States government's relationship with the Lakota people across more than a century. It forced American media and the American public to engage with that history in ways that the standard mythology of the frontier had made it possible to avoid. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 represented the most significant legislative affirmation of tribal sovereignty since the Indian Reorganization Act, giving tribes the authority to manage programs and services on their own behalf rather than through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The legal and political status of Native nations in the 21st century is the product of this entire history. 574 federally recognized tribes exercise varying degrees of sovereignty over territories whose legal status reflects the specific treaty and statutory history of each nation. The reservation system was not a settled historical chapter. It was the beginning of a legal and political relationship that is still being defined, contested, and renegotiated in federal courts today. Understanding that history is not optional if you want to understand the contemporary West. The water rights cases currently before federal courts in the western states. The ongoing disputes over tribal hunting and fishing rights under 19th century treaties. The questions about land and sovereignty that appear in the news with regularity. All of them connect directly to decisions made in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. The past and the present are not separated here by as much distance as the mythology would have you believe. Chapter 11. The West that wasn't white. There is a useful test you can apply to almost any book published before 1980 that claims to tell the story of the American West. Open the index. Look for the names of the people who actually built the physical infrastructure of the West. The railroad workers who blasted through the Sierra Nevada. The vaqueros whose skills and vocabulary became the foundation of the cattle industry. The black cowboys who drove 1 in 4 of the cattle that made that industry profitable. The Japanese and Chinese and Filipino agricultural laborers who transformed California's valleys into one of the most productive farming regions in the world. In most cases, you will find a few pages at most, sometimes nothing at all. The mythology of the American West is, at its structural foundation, a story about Anglo-American men. And that story, when measured against the historical record, requires the erasure of the people who actually built it. That erasure is not simply a matter of historical omission. It is a matter of who has been allowed to claim the West as their story. Begin with the black cowboys. The historian Philip Durham's estimate that approximately 1 in 4 cowboys during the cattle drive era was African American has been broadly supported by subsequent scholarship, with ongoing debate about the specific methodology, and the honest account acknowledges that debate. But even the more conservative estimates describe a workforce significantly more diverse than the mythology presents. Their exclusion from the mythology was not accidental. It was the product of the same racial logic that governed American popular culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When the dime novels, the Wild West shows, and the films that fixed the mythology in popular consciousness were produced by and for audiences whose racial assumptions made black heroism in an Anglo-American founding story either invisible or actively threatening to the tame narrative's ideological function. Nat Love's autobiography has been sitting in libraries since 1907. Its absence from the standard Western canon is a choice that reflects something about who has been deciding which stories get told. The Chinese workers who built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad did not disappear from the West after the Golden Spike was driven in 1869. They stayed. By 1880, approximately 105,000 Chinese immigrants lived in the United States. Approximately 75,000 of them in California, the agricultural development of the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, which transformed California into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, depended heavily on Chinese labor for the construction of levee systems that converted valley floors from seasonal wetlands into farmland, for the harvesting of labor-intensive crops, and for the development of the irrigation infrastructure that extended California agriculture into the drier southern portions of the state. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first federal law to restrict immigration on the basis of race and national origin, was the legislative culmination of an anti-Chinese political movement that had been building in California since the gold rush. The historian Erica Lee, whose book, At America's Gates, is the foundational scholarly study of the act and its implementation, documents the specific mechanisms by which the act transformed Chinese immigrants from a tolerated labor force into an excluded and legally vulnerable population. The act was not repealed until 1943, when the United States and China were allies in the Second World War, and the act's explicit racial basis had become diplomatically inconvenient. The violence that accompanied anti-Chinese sentiment in the West during the 1880s was not isolated. The Rock Springs Massacre of September 2, 1885, in which a mob of white coal miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming Territory, attacked the Chinese quarter of the town, resulted in the deaths of a significant number of Chinese workers, with estimates in the historical literature ranging from 20 to over 24, and the burning of the Chinese residential district to the ground. The federal government paid indemnities to the Chinese government, but prosecuted no one for the deaths. The Mexican population of the American Southwest experienced a systematic dispossession through legal mechanisms that operated across the entire ceded territory after the Mexican-American War. The ranching families whose land grants covered millions of acres became, through legal dispossession and demographic displacement, a subordinated labor force in an economy built on land that had been theirs. The vaquero tradition that gave Anglo-American cowboys their skills, their equipment, and their vocabulary was absorbed into the mythology and stripped of its origins. The word cowboy was taken. The source was erased. The Japanese-American farmers who transformed the agricultural landscape of California and the Pacific Northwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries concentrated in agricultural labor and eventually in agricultural ownership with a speed and success that produced the same legislative backlash that had produced the Chinese Exclusion Act, the California Alien Land Law of 1913, which prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land in California, was explicitly directed at Japanese immigrants. It was tightened in 1920 to close loopholes that had allowed Japanese farmers to hold land in the names of their American-born children. The Japanese-American farming community had become so successful, controlling agricultural sectors, including cut flowers and strawberries, with such efficiency and productivity, that competitors sought legislative protection against their competition. The internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, authorized by President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942 and affecting approximately 120,000 people, two-thirds of them American citizens, was the most severe expression of the racial logic that had governed the treatment of non-white populations in the American West since the Gold Rush. The historian Roger Daniels, whose book Concentration Camps USA was the first comprehensive scholarly examination of Japanese American internment, documents the specific economic interests behind the political pressure for internment: agricultural competitors, real estate interests, and politicians whose constituents wanted the economic competition eliminated. Now hold all of these stories together and notice what they share. In every case, a non-Anglo population provided essential labor or essential knowledge that built a specific sector of the Western economy. In every case, when that population became economically successful or politically visible, a legislative or extra-legal response was organized to eliminate the competition and restrict their rights. In every case, their contribution to the economic development of the West was absorbed into the mythology without acknowledgement of its origins. The Transcontinental Railroad was built by Chinese workers. The California agricultural valleys were developed largely by Asian and Mexican labor. The cattle industry was staffed 1/4 by black cowboys. The ranching tradition was inherited wholesale from Mexican vaqueros. The mythology of the West attributes the development of the region to Anglo-American pioneering spirit, while rendering invisible the demographic groups that provided the labor and the knowledge. This is not simply a matter of historical omission. It is a coherent pattern with a coherent logic. A story that was constructed to serve specific purposes and that required specific erasures to function. All of them built the West. The record says so clearly. The question is why the story was told the way it was, and who benefited from telling it that way. Part of the answer lies in a paper delivered in Chicago in 1893 by a young historian who gave the mythology of the frontier its most durable academic framework, and whose blind spots would require another century to fully excavate. Chapter 12. Closing the Frontier: What Frederick Jackson Turner Got Wrong. On July 12, 1893, a 31-year-old historian from the University of Wisconsin named Frederick Jackson Turner stood before a small audience at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and delivered a paper that would become the most influential and most debated piece of historical writing in American history. The paper was called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. The previous year, the United States Census Bureau had issued a report noting that the American frontier, defined as a line of settlement with fewer than 2 persons per square mile, could no longer be traced on the national map. Turner took that bureaucratic observation and built from it an argument about the entire meaning of American civilization that would echo through presidential speeches, foreign policy decisions, and popular culture for the next century and beyond. His argument, stripped to its essential claim, was this: the existence of free land on the western frontier and the continuous process of settlement and resettlement that the frontier made possible had been the primary force shaping American character and American democratic institutions. The frontier experience had created the qualities that made Americans distinctively American: individualism, practicality, democratic instinct, resistance to hierarchy, optimism about the future. European immigrants who crossed the frontier were transformed by the experience into Americans. Their old world identities dissolved by contact with the wilderness and rebuilt in the image of the self-reliant frontiersman. The frontier was, in Turner's formulation, the crucible of American democracy. The argument was elegant, emotionally resonant, and arrived at precisely the moment when American intellectual culture was anxious about what the closing of the frontier meant for the national future. Turner's thesis shaped American historical writing for decades. It influenced Theodore Roosevelt, who had been developing similar ideas independently and who used the frontier thesis to support his advocacy for American expansionism abroad. It influenced the design of the national park system. It influenced Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, several of which were designed with explicit reference to creating frontier-like conditions of individual initiative and collective challenge in an urbanized industrial society that no longer had a literal frontier to offer. The problem with Turner's thesis is not that it identified nothing real. The frontier experience was genuinely significant in the development of American culture and institutions. And Turner's insight that geography shapes political culture was a genuine contribution to historical thinking. The problem is what the thesis required to be invisible in order to function. The historian Patricia Limerick, whose book, The Legacy of Conquest, launched what historians call the New Western History and challenged Turner's framework directly, articulates the central objection clearly. Turner's frontier was a line of advance, moving continuously westward, the edge of civilization, pushing back wilderness. Before the line was, in Turner's own language, free land, available for the taking, waiting to be transformed from wilderness into productive American territory. But the land was not free. It was not empty. It was not wilderness in any sense that the people living on it would have recognized. It was occupied, cultivated in many cases, organized under political systems that the Turner thesis did not have a category for, by millions of people whose existence the free land formulation required to erase. Once you remove the erasure, the entire framework shifts. What Turner described as the advance of civilization across free land was, from another angle, a sustained military and legal campaign to dispossess populations that had occupied the land for thousands of years. What he described as the formation of American democratic character was, from another angle, the formation of a settler colonial identity that defined itself against the peoples it displaced and used that opposition as the foundation of its own self-understanding. The historian Richard White has described Turner's thesis, in his analysis of the mythologies that shaped American expansion, as a story that allowed Americans to understand their acquisition of the continent as the working out of natural historical forces, rather than as the consequence of specific political decisions that carried specific moral weight. Whether or not you find that framing fully persuasive, the specific history this documentary has traced makes clear that the thesis provided a narrative in which the displacement of native peoples was not a political event requiring moral evaluation, but a natural process, as inevitable and as morally neutral as the movement of a weather front. Turner's thesis also shaped American thinking about the implications of the frontier's closing in ways that had direct consequences for foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt provided one answer to the question of where the frontier's energy would go next. The frontier would extend beyond the borders of the continental United States, into the Pacific, into Latin America, into any region where American power could be projected. The Spanish-American War of 1898, which gave the United States control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, was partly framed in the language of frontier expansion extended to a global stage. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana argued on the floor of the Senate in January of 1899 that the Philippines were ours forever and that American destiny required their administration. The language connects directly to the manifest destiny rhetoric of the 1840s and the frontier thesis of the 1890s. The historian Amy Kaplan, in her book, The Anarchy of Empire, documents how the ideological frameworks developed to justify westward expansion were recycled and reapplied to justify overseas expansion at the turn of the 20th century. The frontier did not close in 1890. In the analysis of scholars like Kaplan and Slotkin, it relocated. Whether you find their argument fully persuasive or partially so, the pattern they identify is worth examining carefully. Turner's thesis also had a blind spot beyond its erasure of native peoples. By making Anglo-American settler experience the definitive American experience, it excluded from its framework of American character formation the very populations whose labor had built the frontier economy. The Chinese workers who built the railroads, the Mexican vaqueros who developed the cattle industry, the African-American cowboys who drove the cattle. None of them appear in Turner's account of how the frontier shaped American democracy. They were present on the frontier. They were not present in the frontier thesis. The new Western history that Limerick, White, and their colleagues developed in the 1980s and 90s proposed a different framework. Western history, in this framework, is not the story of a line moving westward until it reaches the Pacific and disappears. It is the story of a place, a specific geographic region with specific environmental constraints and specific human histories, in which multiple populations have lived, conflicted, accommodated, and been transformed by their interactions with each other and with the land across several centuries. This framework has the considerable advantage of being able to account for the full diversity of the Western population, for the ongoing presence of native peoples and their legal and political relationships with the federal government, and for the continuities between the 19th century West and the 21st century West that the frontier thesis, with its emphasis on a historical moment that closed in 1890, could not accommodate. Turner asked the right question. What made Americans American? He found a compelling answer in the wrong place, because the place he looked required him to ignore most of the people who were actually there. The full answer, if there is one, has to be large enough to include all of them. The American West was not a closed chapter in 1890. The processes set in motion by the events this documentary has examined did not stop when the Census Bureau announced that the frontier line had disappeared. They continued, in modified forms, shaping land ownership patterns, water rights law, political representation, and the distribution of economic opportunity in ways that connect the present directly to the past. And the myth that Turner helped codify did not retire when the frontier closed. It adapted. It found new applications. And the next chapter examines where that myth went, what it did when it got there, and why understanding its origins is not merely a matter of historical interest, but a matter of practical relevance for anyone trying to make sense of the country the West helped build. Chapter 13. The myth is still running. Picture a movie theater in 1939. The film is Stagecoach, directed by John Ford, starring a young actor named Marion Morrison, who performed under the name John Wayne. The film is set in the Southwest in the 1880s. John Wayne's character is the hero. The Apache are the threat from which the passengers must be protected. The Apache appear in the film as a faceless, wordless mass of violence, defined entirely by their relationship to the white characters whose story the film is actually telling. Stagecoach was not an unusual film for its time. It was a masterpiece of its genre, technically brilliant and narratively compelling, and it demonstrated with particular efficiency the specific narrative function that Native peoples served in the Hollywood Western, not as characters with their own histories and perspectives, but as the wilderness itself made human. The Western film genre, which dominated American cinema from the silent era through the 1960s and produced hundreds of films seen by hundreds of millions of people worldwide, was the single most powerful mechanism through which the mythology of the frontier was transmitted to the 20th century and to the world. The ideological content of that mythology, the story of Anglo-American civilization advancing across a wilderness populated by obstacles rather than peoples, was delivered through some of the most technically accomplished filmmaking of the century, in a form so entertaining that its audience rarely noticed the argument it was making. The writer and activist Vine Deloria Jr., whose book Custer Died for Your Sins, published in 1969, was one of the most important works of Native American political writing of the 20th century, described the impact of Western films on American public understanding with precision. The films created what he called a composite Indian, a generic figure drawn from the visual vocabulary of Plains cultures in the 1860s and applied indiscriminately to Native peoples of all regions, all periods, and all cultural traditions. This composite displaced real knowledge about specific nations and specific histories with a fictional image that served the mythology's needs rather than historical truth. The composite Indian of the Western was not simply inaccurate. It was actively harmful to the political interests of real Native peoples, because it framed them as historical figures rather than contemporary citizens, as peoples whose story had ended in the 19th century rather than peoples whose legal and political relationships with the United States government were ongoing and whose rights were still being contested in federal courts. The Western film genre underwent significant revision beginning in the late 1960s. Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch in 1969, Arthur Penn's Little Big Man in 1970, Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves in 1990, and Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven in 1992 all examined the mythology's assumptions with a more critical eye. Their commercial and critical success demonstrated that audiences could engage with a more complicated version of the frontier story. But revision is not replacement. The classic Western mythology proved remarkably durable precisely because it addressed needs in American culture that the revisionist critique did not eliminate. The need for a foundational story of national origins that was morally uncomplicated. The need for a narrative of American character that explained American exceptionalism without requiring engagement with the costs that underwrote it. The need for a story in which the problems of American society were located in the past, safely concluded, rather than in the present, still unresolved. The connection between the mythology of the frontier and American foreign policy is one of the most studied relationships in the field of American cultural history. The historian Richard Slotkin, whose trilogy on the mythology of the frontier concluding with Gunfighter Nation, published in 1992, is the most comprehensive scholarly examination of this relationship. Traces the specific ways in which frontier mythology appeared consistently in the justification for American interventions abroad across the 20th century. Whether you find Slotkin's argument fully persuasive or partially so, the pattern he identifies across more than a century of American foreign policy rhetoric is worth examining carefully. The use of the term Indian country as military slang for hostile or contested territory, documented in accounts from Vietnam through more recent conflicts by scholars including Carl Jacobi and others, is one concrete example of how the vocabulary of the 19th century West persisted in American military culture long after the historical context that produced it had ended. Its persistence suggests something about how deeply the frontier mythology was embedded in American institutional culture, something that the documentary and scholarly record supports, without requiring us to draw conclusions about specific policy decisions that go beyond what the evidence can establish. These are patterns that serious historians have identified and that are worth understanding, while also acknowledging that causal relationships between mythology and specific policy decisions are genuinely difficult to establish with precision. The honest position is that these connections appear significant in the scholarly literature, and that examining them is worthwhile. While presenting them as the active debates they remain, rather than as settled conclusions. The Standing Rock conflict of 2016 brought the unresolved history of the American West into the most visible national conversation it had generated in decades. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe's opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline centered on treaty-protected territory and the Missouri River upstream from the reservation's water supply. The legal arguments the tribe made drew on the same treaty framework. Specifically, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the subsequent treaty history that had defined the legal relationship between the United States government and the Lakota people for more than 150 years. Whether you agree with the tribe's legal arguments or not, the Standing Rock conflict makes clear that the questions raised by the history of the American West are not settled. They are active. They are being argued in federal courts and in legislative chambers and in communities across the West right now. The Supreme Court's ruling in McGirt versus Oklahoma, decided in 2020, held that the Creek Nation's reservation in eastern Oklahoma had never been formally disestablished by Congress and that the land therefore remained Indian country for purposes of federal criminal jurisdiction, affecting the legal status of approximately 3 million acres. The ruling was a direct consequence of the specific treaty and statutory history of the 5 civilized tribes, demonstrating that the legal questions generated by 19th century treaty making are still being resolved in the 21st century. The land back movement raises questions about historical land transfers and the moral and legal obligations of the contemporary United States government that serious people disagree about, and that this documentary does not attempt to do. Resolve for you. What the historical record does establish clearly is that the land transfers in question were accompanied by treaty violations. Legal manipulation. and in some cases outright fraud that the documentary record supports without serious scholarly dispute. How contemporary society should respond to that history is a genuinely contested political question, and it is worth engaging with honestly, rather than dismissing or oversimplifying in either direction. These are ongoing debates, not settled conclusions. The honest observer can acknowledge the historical record while recognizing that reasonable people hold different views about its contemporary implications. So let us return, one final time, to the question that opened this documentary. Was the American West an adventure story, or was it a conquest story? The answer the evidence supports is that it was both, at the same time, in the same places, involving the same people. The settlers who crossed the plains in covered wagons were genuinely brave. The hardship they endured was genuinely severe. The communities they built were genuine achievements of human resilience. None of that is diminished by acknowledging that the land they settled had been taken. Through mechanisms this documentary has examined in detail, from people who had lived on it for thousands of years. The Lakota warriors who defeated Custer at Little Bighorn were genuinely skilled and courageous. The resistance of the Comanche, the Apache, the Nez Perce, the dozens of other nations who fought to defend their territories and their families was remarkable by any honest standard. None of that requires us to ignore the violence that native peoples also inflicted. The raids, the captive taking, the intertribal conflicts that were part of the same history, the Chinese workers who blasted through the Sierra Nevada, the black cowboys who drove cattle across the Texas range, the Mexican families who farmed land their ancestors had farmed under 3 different flags, the Japanese-American farmers who built agricultural systems of extraordinary productivity and then lost everything to a policy driven by racial fear and economic envy. All of them were part of the West. Their stories are not supplements to the main narrative. They are the main narrative. Quanah Parker navigated the destruction of one world and the building of another with more intelligence and more grace than most people facing far smaller challenges managed to find. Nat Love rode across the same Texas range that the mythology made exclusively white, and left a record of it that sat in libraries waiting to be read. Pope organized a revolt against an empire, changed the terms of its rule, and was erased from the history of the country that eventually absorbed his people's land. The American West was not a myth waiting to happen. It was a place with a history, full of people who deserved to be seen whole. The myth told you the frontier closed in 1890. The history tells you the questions the frontier raised are still open. You now have both. What you do with them is yours to decide.